Hello and welcome to the Arise interview, where we take time to reflect on the big stories from the news and on the fortunes and affairs of the world in an hour of conversation with commentators, analysts and thought leaders. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, Scepticism in Nigeria as the government announces it's shutting down a controversial special anti-robbery squad known as SARS amid continuing police brutality and demonstrations over the weekend, both in Nigeria and abroad. It's more widespread reform of the entire Nigerian police force the only answer. We have reaction and analysis. And later, the stage is set for an extraordinary partisan clash in the US 3 weeks before Election Day as Amy Coney Barrett appears on Capitol Hill for the opening of her Supreme Court confirmation hearings. The proceedings will last 4 days as Republicans move ahead with the nomination, confident they'll have the votes to rush Ms. Barrett through, even as Democrats stridently object. We'll assess the situation coming up. Well, let's begin straight away with that hugely controversial Nigerian anti-robbery squad, better known, some say, for robbing rather than for catching robbers. We're talking, of course, about SARS, a notorious police unit that has an unenviable reputation for using excessive force against civilians. In the conversations of ordinary Nigerians, SARS has so many negative things attached to it: brutality, extortion, torture, and even murder. Well, after considerable protests, in some cases deadly, in Nigeria, but also demonstrations outside the country's embassies in European nations such as the UK and Germany, the Nigerian government announced at the weekend that the SARS unit will be disbanded.
This opportunity to say a word on the recent genuine concerns and agitations by Nigerians about the excessive use of force and in some cases extrajudicial killings and wrongful conduct by men of the Nigerian police force. The disbanding of SARS is only the first step in our commitment to extensive police reform in order to ensure that the primary duty of the police and other law enforcement agencies remains the protection of lives and livelihoods of our people. We will also ensure that all those responsible for misconduct or wrongful acts are brought to justice. We also deeply regret the loss of life of the young man in Oyo State during the recent demonstrations. I have directed that the circumstances of his death should be thoroughly investigated. Meanwhile, it is important to recognize that the vast majority of men and women of the police force are hardworking and diligent in performing their duties. The few bad eggs should not be allowed to tarnish the image and reputation of the force.
That's President Buhari there. So is it enough for those campaigning against SARS? Well, one of the more vigorous campaigners against that unit is Amnesty International. Its country director in Nigeria is Osai Ojigho, and she joins me now in the studio. And later I'll also be joined from our overflow studio by Arise political editor Sumner Shagari Sambo. Thank you very much indeed, Osai, for joining us. This is what you were campaigning for. Do you welcome the announcement to disband SARS?
Thank you, Charles. Definitely we welcome the disbandment of SARS as a unit within the police force. But more importantly, we are still waiting for that big issue, which is accountability. We've seen this happen many times before. And so we believe that for the government to actually succeed this time around, they need to put more action and they need to put the political will in ensuring that the perpetrators of these violations that have been reported against SARS officers are actually brought to book. we are tired of having to go through this circle time and time again. So I think now is the time for them to act.
The problem is that there's a great deal of anecdotal evidence and hearsay about SARS, and it's very tough to find real solid evidence because they haven't yet been investigated in a prosecutorial way, have they? I mean, you're a lawyer yourself.
Yes, and sadly so, because the police tends to want to, first of all, carry out their own internal investigation, which we all concede to. But thereafter, if you find that someone is guilty of a crime or suspected of committing a crime, then you have to allow the civil courts to take its course. That's the missing link in terms of the way they've handled these complaints in the past. Even when the presidential panel was set up on SARS in 2018 by the then acting president, Professor Ojigho, you found that when the National Human Rights Commission Executive Secretary presented the report to the president, we all expected, okay, the recommendations of this groundbreaking work would be revealed and would be taken into action. But that hasn't happened. So we don't know what's going to come out of those recommendations. Even cases that we have directed to the relevant authorities have not been dealt with. There were many SARS officers that were linked to units reported in our research. Till date, they are still walking around acting like as if nothing has happened. And I must say that Amnesty started looking at SARS in particular as a unit of the police force in 2016 when we released our report. And June 2020, we updated it with Time to End Impunity, because clearly between that time, the affairs of the unit has continued to go on without any sort of control or coordination.
Well, I mean, I think I understand, and a lot of people understand, the motivation and why you're passionate about this. I mean, that's why you had all the people out on the streets. It's clearly an issue that touches at the very heart of the Nigerian people. But practically speaking, the other issue is, of course, what to do with them. I mean, there are a lot of people in the SARS unit who are trained, they're armed. I mean, you can't just get rid of them and throw them out on the streets. Is there some way that they could be reformed and this can be done less dramatically or drastically?
So I think the first step is for the authorities, and now these are the police authorities first of all, to look into all those complaints that they've received, and also the recommendations that has been given before with regards to specific officers. So they need to filter, first of all, those who have complaints and those who don't. So those who have complaints, they will have to set up committees and panels to decide how they will evaluate them. So that is one, separate. So those that don't have complaints, they should now take an assessment of their capacities, their skill set, what they bring to the table, and where they could better serve their purposes. But at the same time, ensure that they are trained, because a lot of things have happened in SARS, that you don't want officers who are used to doing things anyhow, as we say in Nigeria, to continue to permit those practices elsewhere. Because one of the issues that we have raised in the past is that when you complain about a particular officer, it just gets redeployed, but it's not corrected. So I think this is an opportunity for them to say, look, the way you guys were behaving in SARS is over. It will not be tolerated. You know, you basically read the Riot Act to them. And so we're redeploying you here, and we'll be monitoring you to see that if there are any complaints in the next few months, then you would also join the list of those that are currently under investigation. And then the third point would be to ensure that looking at the police as a structure, what is wrong and why is it so flawed, and what needs to change. So many people have brought up the issues about resources within the force. People have talked about access to information, but most importantly, what sort of facilities do we want in a modern police force in order for them to carry out their functions without them needing to justify the violence that they are using against other people? Because it's almost like, oh, see me, I am in such a bad situation, so I can't help myself. That is the kinds of feedback we're getting. So we don't want that to continue, because sadly, the young people are not having any of it. As you can see, many are demanding for change because they have been the major targets. like our research discovered, the major targets of this unit, notorious for extortion, extrajudicial executions, torture, arbitrary detention and arrest, and you can go on and on in terms of how they've abused the trust given to them in order to perpetrate these crimes.
But do you concede, though, that the Nigerian police is almost as brutalized, as someone put it, as the people that they're brutalizing? In other words, the system has put them through the ringer, if you like. They're underpaid, they're undertrained, they're under-equipped. I mean, they are ravaged by poverty.
Yeah.
Their accommodation where they live is absolutely horrendous. This is a system that has beaten them down. And the fact that they're even able to do any aspect of their job with any level or measure of thoroughness is almost miraculous. Do you concede that?
Yeah, we recognize that the police in Nigeria have been given the short end of the stick, so to speak. And the kind of support that the military, for example, has had is not the same support the police have had. And this makes it very difficult for them to live up to expectations. But we also recognize that because of their training, which is different from you and I, they can use arms, they can use force in order to maintain law and order. And how they use that can exacerbate situations, as we have seen in this protest. So it's not a case of my pain is bigger than yours, but rather the fact that because you've been given a position of authority, how you use that authority, and how best can you bring about your own complaints so that they can be addressed. Sadly, I watched with horror some of the videos circulating over the weekend, particularly those of protesters, even here in Abuja, that were pushed back with water tanks. Tanks were chasing people that were already fleeing. And these are issues we've raised before. If somebody you are chasing leaves, why continue to pursue them?
No, that is totally unacceptable.
It's just completely out of
out of proportion. Well, the government has said that going forward, there will be an investigating committee that will involve civil society groups, human rights bodies such as your own. They're going to be investigating abuses by the police, not necessarily just SARS, but I understand more broadly across the sort of the police force. Do you have faith in that process?
I think we need to see a timeline first. We need to see the terms of reference. We need to know how they are going to select who sits on those panels. And we would need a commitment that this panel is not going to go the way of others before. I've been here many times, and we've seen many times before in Nigeria. All these panels are set up, reports are written, and then they become state secrets, and nobody knows what has become of them. The recommendations are only known by a very few, and the rest of us are left to continue like as if nothing has happened. So if we want to commit to a process, it needs to be open, it needs to be transparent, it needs to be clear. All of us needs to know what role we are playing in it, and whether the political support from the executive would also be present, so that whenever there are officers that have been found wanting, they are treated within the law. No one should be excluded, because that often has been the case. Okay,
stay with us, please. I want to talk with you some more. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our analysis of the decision to dissolve the controversial Nigerian police unit known as SARS. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, as you might have heard, campaigners in Nigeria have responded with skepticism to the announcement that a police unit known by its acronym of SARS, widely accused of brutality, has been disbanded. Protesters had called for the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, or SARS, to be broken up, but they are unhappy that its officers and agents are being redeployed to other units rather than being disciplined. SARS is a controversial brigade. It's been accused of unlawful arrests, extortion, torture, and extrajudicial killings. The dissolution of the squad followed days of nationwide protests sparked by a video shared on social media of police officers allegedly killing a civilian. And with me in the studio, the country director in Nigeria for Amnesty International, Osai Ojigho. And from our overflow studio, I'm delighted to say that Arise political editor Sumner Shagari Sambo joins us now. Good to see you, Sumner. Let me come straight away to you. You've been taking the temperature and gauging the mood on the ground. The squad is to be disbanded, its members redeployed. Does that solve anything from your analysis and assessments, or is the skepticism of many campaigners justified?
Well, thanks, Charles. The political barometer right now, if I may read from that aspect first, is actually one of tension within the hierarchy of the Nigerian government, that this may actually snowball into an anti-government protest if it's not properly handled. And that's why you've seen some concessions by the Nigerian government beginning from yesterday, when President Muhammadu Buhari issued instructions through the Inspector General of Police, IGP Mohammed Adamu, to ensure that this time around the dissolution of SARS is actually upheld, and then that we wouldn't have that unit again. But there is something that's actually going on that the government wants to do. It actually wants to reform the policing system. So it's not as if, yeah, SARS has been pushed aside, it has been dissolved, but the government is thinking of working out a new system that will actually tackle robbery and all of that. Now that reform system is underway, and Vice President Yemi Osinbajo, while discussing what President Buhari has said earlier today, asked that Nigerians be patient with the government as they try to see that these reforms are actually institutionalized. Now, if you look at some of the provisions that actually set up the Nigerian police, you will discover that there is this critical aspect, which is section 215 subsection 5 of the 1999 Constitution as amended, actually gives the police authorities the powers to receive instruction from the president and governors, and those instructions will be carried out without anyone having the right to question them in court. And those are some of the platforms that the police commissioners and then other members of the hierarchy down to the DPO have been using to actually issue out directives and instructions to the men of the federal SARS, and to the extent that we've had all of this. Now, back to your question, this may not totally assuage the feelings of the campaigners, because what they want is for some of these persons to be fished out. Some of the deviant policemen within the disbanded SARS to be fished out, but that may actually be very difficult if the government does not have a profile of earlier complaints that have been laid against specific officers so that they will be dealt with. So it's a good one, but I think what the government is proposing right now is that there will be a meeting with civil society groups and other campaigners, I mean, like the Amnesty International head that we have there in Nigeria, to actually see how these new reforms that will be brought in place will be institutionalized and then taken to the National Assembly, and then see how that constitutional aspect can be amended. But it actually takes time, because before you can amend that section 215 subsection 5, that means you have to do a constitutional review, and then it will have to go through 36 states of the Federation, and we must have 24 states agreeing that that part should be expunged or reviewed before it's come back to the National Assembly and then Mr. President assents. So it's a potpourri of issues, but I think the best step was the dissolution as it happened yesterday.
And some Nigerian activists, from my observation, put on your international hat and tell me what you think. They seem to have been emboldened by global protests against the police in general following the killing of George Floyd in the US and the subsequent Black Lives Matter demonstrations. Is that in some ways a catalyst for this, in your assessment?
Yes, Charles. Police brutality is actually a global phenomenon. If you go into developed societies, you'll see that it's still a constant issue. Even in Europe, that doesn't seem to have, these issues portrayed formally. you know, on live TV and all of that. You still see, even in the UK, it's a big challenge, I mean, because there is something within the code or the training books and manuals of the police globally that actually tries to ensure that, you know, it makes them look like they are special sets of citizens while handling the citizens of countries. So it's in the light of all of this televising of this Black Lives Matters and then the protests in the UK and all of that, that in one way or the other have emboldened this set of people. Don't forget, Charles, the group or the category of the population of people who are protesting in Nigeria are those within 16 to 35. Now, these are the set of people too that we also have that are huge among the population, and then that engage on some crimes, because the SARS too are actually saying that, look, we have been doing a lot to protect Nigerians and even foreigners from the issue of the popular Yahoo, which is internet scam and all of that. A lot of young boys have found themselves engaging in these vices, and it's within this population that you have all of these youths doing all of that. But it's also not everyone that engages in that, because there are some very young entrepreneurs who own businesses and they are thriving, and when they buy flashy cars and all of that, the police people just, you know, stop them on the way, and the next thing they just start doing is to start you know, putting them into that same ball game of referring to them as Yahoo boys and all of that. So yes, what is happening within the international scene in one way or the other may have emboldened them. But the good thing is that the government is actually waking up to its responsibility, because these reforms have been on for a long period of time. Nigerians have been asking the government to actually look at police brutality, and in such a way that even President Muhammadu Buhari, who's in power, in the previous government before 2015, while they were protesting, had at a particular point in time fallen victim to tear gas and all of that being thrown at him and some of his supporters. And then it also goes back way into the past, where you see that popular Nigerian activists like late Gani Fahimi were actually, you know, brutalized by the police. So the call for reforms have been there for a long period of time, and this is the right time for the executive to combine their strength with the parliament to ensure that a new legislation that actually gives a new code of practice to the police actually comes out.
Okay, I mean, that's a very, very interesting points, Sumner. And let me bring in Osai Ojigho, who's the country director for Amnesty International. You've been listening to that, obviously. Activists like you, who have been consistent over the years, managed to get the attention of people not just in Nigeria, but outside Nigeria.
Exactly.
I mean, there were protests in the UK, Germany, Canada, and of course, End SARS was the top trending hashtag globally. I'm kind of reminded of the Bring Back Our Girls campaign. So a pretty remarkable development there.
Definitely, and I think that it shows that many more people are sensitized nowadays than in the past. And it also shows the level of tolerance people have had over the years for the bad behavior and the abuses they've suffered. So it just took one incident now to trigger this whole line of protests. And the energy that we are seeing from the various movements on the ground is that people want answers. They're tired of excuses.
Right.
They want results.
Okay, let me ask you this very quickly, because we're almost out of time. Do you see the protests continuing? Are you going to carry on campaigning and protesting? And do you see other people and groups joining in those protests going forward?
Yes. From all indications, the protests are continuing. Amnesty International will continue to campaign and would also continue to advocate for safety for protesters, and that the right to protest is a human right, and that other groups everywhere is joining, businesses, the tech community, people that ordinarily are outside of the civic space conversation are all having an interest to stake, because who do you employ? You employ young people, and you want the safety of your staff, of your family members.
Right.
So this is an issue that concerns each and every one of us.
Osai Ojigho, country director for Amnesty International, and of course Arise political editor Sumner Shagari Sambo. Thank you very much indeed to both of you. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead, including the stage is set for an extraordinary partisan clash in the US 3 weeks before Election Day. Stay with us.